Hi, I'm Craig Waterman from ESE's Educator Effectiveness Team. The CAP process involves gathering multiple types of evidence and then using the CAP rubric to analyze it. One of the sources of evidence required in CAP is at least one measure of student learning. Using measures of student learning within an evaluation can be challenging because there are so many different factors that can impact student learning outside of an educator's control. However, they are a critical component because they represent the most direct measure of teaching. During the pre-cycle step, supervising practitioners, with support from the program supervisors, will select an assessment that measures a meaningful sample of the content the candidate will be responsible for teaching during the practicum. Whenever possible, supervising practitioners should identify an assessment that he or she already intended to use with his or her students. This might be a unit test, a performance task, or any other assessment that is well aligned to content and provides meaningful information back about what students have learned. Remember, this is about utilizing meaningful assessments, not finding an additional assessment solely to fulfill the CAP requirements. The assessment should be administered at the instructionally appropriate time, even if that means administering it prior to the end of the practicum. Whenever possible, a measure of student growth should be used. Growth measures provide greater insight into student learning than a single point-in-time assessment because they account for varying levels of student knowledge, skills, and readiness. It is great practice for a teacher candidate to administer and analyze results from assessments that show change over time. However, if a growth measure is not available or feasible in the context of a practicum, achievement measures may be used. Clearly defining what range of growth or achievement is expected prior to administering an assessment is a challenging but important task. It supports planning and provides more objective feedback to teachers about the quality of their instruction. As a result, once the administered assessment is selected, but prior to administering, the supervising practitioner should establish parameters for a range of expected performance on the assessment. For example, if a candidate will be administering a pre- and post-assessment, the supervising practitioner should review the post-test carefully and think about how he or she believes students should perform on the test after instruction. In other words, how many additional questions would students answer correctly on the post-test? Using his or her professional judgment, the supervising practitioner should define a range of scores that will represent expected performance. Scores below that range will be considered lower than expected, and scores above that range will be considered higher than expected. If pretest scores will not be available, the supervising practitioner should look for an alternative way of establishing an expected range of student performance. For example, if the teacher candidate is responsible for teaching a math unit, the supervising practitioner may choose the end-of-unit assessment as a measure of student learning to include in CAP. Over the past 4 units, the average end-of-unit assessment scores were 84, 89, 81, and 83. The supervising practitioner may determine that a class average between 80 and 90 represents expected achievement. As a result, less than 80 represents lower than expected achievement, and more than 90 represents higher than expected achievement. The assessment and parameters should be shared with the candidate as early in the practicum as possible to support backwards planning, which is why this step occurs in the pre-cycle. This category of evidence must, at a minimum, inform ratings on 4 of the 6 essential practices: well-structured lessons, adjustments to practice, meeting diverse needs, and reflective practice. As you can see, the student's performance on the assessment is not the point of emphasis in CAP. Rather, assessors should consider how the candidate uses the assessment content and results to inform his or her instruction, from planning lessons to making adjustments to meet the needs of all students. The experience of administering, scoring, and analyzing a measure of student learning, growth, or achievement is a crucial component of CAP. It is an essential skill of every effective teacher to be able to draw conclusions about his or her practice from student outcome data. Therefore, it is important to gauge a candidate's aptitude to develop this skill. It is important to note that a measure of student learning, growth, or achievement is not a complete measure of a candidate's impact on student learning. In the Educator Evaluation Framework, multiple measures over multiple years are used to inform conclusions about educator impact. Given the abbreviated classroom experience associated with CAP, it is impossible to generate enough data to draw a conclusion about the candidate's impact on student learning. It is possible, however, to assess the candidate's ability to reflect on student outcomes and make connections to his or her practice.